Well everybody, it's a new year, and there's plenty of new stuff that awaits us in the future, so what better way to start than by looking back at the highlights of my Versus series known as Show Off Showdown. Throughout the past 2 years, and 3 months of this series' existence to this day, there have been some great episodes, and some not so great ones. So as of now, I will be listing the top 10 worst and best episodes of Show Off Showdown. I will start off with the worst listing first, and then follow up with the best ones after. Kinda like how you want to hear the bad news first, so the good news will seem better later. You bring them down before you bring them back up. Now keep in mind, this is just my point of view of this series as a whole. I'm sure there are some episodes here that some of you have enjoyed, or not. Whichever ones you guys think are the best or worst is entirely up for you to decide, but this is just how I feel that these episodes turned out. Now let's get started, shall we? Starting with the top 10 worst episodes of Show Off Showdown. Leonardo vs. Ruby. Because this is the very first episode of my series, I'll cut it some slack. After all, you can't always expect your first attempt to be perfect. Now let's see, where do I even begin? Well, for starters, the fight scene is too short. Only like 17 seconds in total. That's right, only 17 seconds of fighting in over 8 minutes of talking. That alone should tell you that the episode will get boring real quick. Now as for the more important reasons, I will admit I didn't do a very good job explaining the outcome in the post-analysis, and there were a lot of details that I didn't include. But in a way, that was partially intentional. You see, the reason why I didn't explain the results in long explicit detail is because I assumed that people read the pre-analysis before watching the video, so they already know most of the important details beforehand, so I wouldn't have to explain as much. But it appears I was wrong. You see, for most of my episodes, what I usually do is I write the pre-analysis in a journal entry on DeviantArt, and sometimes collab with other people while putting it together, and then I put a link to the pre-analysis on DeviantArt in the video's description. But it appears as if nobody ever reads the pre-analysis, even though I clearly state at the beginning of almost every single episode that I put links to the analysis in the description below. But let's face it, nobody cares about the pre-analysis unless it's included in the video, so why do I even try? Anyway, it was good collaborating with Armando 9000 being the animator for the first episode. That was a nice touch, but other than that, this just isn't what I call a well-developed episode. But once again, it was the first episode of the series, so I didn't really expect it to be perfect anyway. Black Panther vs. Trap Shadow. Now, this isn't too bad of an episode, which is why I didn't put it too high on the list. Now, if you ask me, this episode mainly just feels like a fad, and that is easily forgettable after a short while. You see, back when the movie Black Panther was still in theaters, it was insanely popular and everybody was going gaga over it. Now, if you ask me, this episode was basically just an attempt to cash in on that popularity and board the Black Panther hype train. Did it work? Well, the episode is okay. Not the worst, but definitely not the best either. The research was fine, but the outcome was kinda obvious. Not only because the results were clear if you know these characters well enough, but this episode pretty much revolved and leaned towards Black Panther a bit more, so it's no surprise either way. Now on another note, the fight scene wasn't all that impressive. I basically just reused old MMD motions from previous videos, so there's nothing new to see really. Not to mention, the model I used to represent Trap Shadow doesn't look anything like him. You see, for most of my Skylanders battles, because there are no MMD models of any of the Skylanders, I usually just look for different models that look similar to the characters to represent them. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It clearly didn't do too well in this case. Not to mention, I also did some voice acting for this episode. It was alright, until I realized that I forgot to adjust the microphone sensitivity, and as soon as my voice got louder, it started to sound a little more, ear rapey. You know what? I think I've said enough. Weiss vs. Elsa. Now for starters, let's talk about the animation. Now, this was actually one of my very first attempts at using MMD, and yeah, it kinda looks like crap. But considering that it was my very first attempt trying to use MMD, I can definitely see some of the problems I faced there, and have since learned to fix some of them. Now as for the research, most people seem to agree, and I thought it was alright, although this is a battle between Weiss and Elsa. The outcome is pretty obvious if you really think about it. It's likely that you already knew who would win from the start before you even watched the video, so there's really not much point in watching the video other than for the entertainment value. But if you still enjoyed this episode anyway, that's good to hear. Anyway, moving on. Blake vs. Nightmare. Wait, another Ruby and Skylanders fight? I think I'm starting to see a pattern here. Anyway, once again, the research was fine, but the outcome was probably a little obvious if you've seen enough of my Skylanders fights, but that's a whole other argument I'd rather not get into right now. Anyway, how would I describe the animation? Well, remember what I said I sometimes improvise by using different MMD models to represent the Skylanders characters? Well, the model I used to represent Nightmare here has to be one of the worst improvises I've ever done. I've even made that pretty clear in the actual episode. Now, Blake's model looked really good, and the background was decent too, but Nightmare's improvised model was just a hideous, unprofessional disaster. I swear, it's like taking a shiny bar of gold and dipping it in a pile of moldy crap. Well, on the bright side, at least the animation didn't last very long, thank God. Now, the second half of the fight scene wasn't really animated, but was actually just Soul Calibur gameplay with custom models made to look like the characters, and I didn't even film it. Don't get me wrong, Cope the Bear did a great job making the models look like the characters, but other than that and the research, this wasn't my best episode by a long shot. Now that I think about it, the only really important reason for making this episode was to make way for the next battle between Knuckles vs. Terrafin, which was teased at the end of the episode. Enough said. Pyro vs. Torch. Well, once again, there was nothing really wrong with the research, but the fight scene was far from perfect. You see, I've noticed that a lot of people have been complaining that I've been using the exact same MMD motions over and over again, and that's gotten repetitive and annoying. I can see what they meant. So for this episode, I decided to try something new. So I found a whole bunch of new MMD motions that I've never used before, and I thought they would totally make the episode more fresh. But where did it go wrong? Well, it appears that I might have tried a few too many new things at once. While the animation was not a simulation, the way it was presented ranged from confusing to flat out ridiculous. Some of the new motions I used were just plain random, made no sense at all, and didn't tie in well together, and all that together made the perfect recipe for absolute cringe. Oh, and not to mention, the biggest problem I faced while animating was the Pyro's model. It was the only model of Pyro I could find, and it was barely functional because the model's arms just kept glitching and clipping through the body, which made it really hard to work with while animating. In fact, you could see it happen quite often during the episode. Oh, and not to mention, there was a short scene I forgot to include, so if the episode feels incomplete, that's probably why. But it probably wouldn't have saved the episode anyway. Nini vs. Shante. Now, I just can't help but feel that I completely rushed this episode. I wrote the script, recorded my voice, did the animation, and put it all together all in less than one day. So yeah, not a lot of time went into it. Judging by how short the fight scene was and how limited the animation options were, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So not only was this episode rushed, but I'll admit, I also didn't do a very good job explaining Shante. In fact, I can't help but feel like I kinda downplayed Shante in this episode. If you've seen my much later episode, Shante vs. Crash Bandicoot, you could tell I did a much better job with the research on her. Now, the outcome of Nini vs. Shante probably hasn't changed even with the updated research, but I still feel like I could have done a better job with it. And I feel like I could have put more effort into this episode as a whole. Oh, and not to mention, I was actually working on 3 other episodes at the exact same time I worked on this one, which is probably another reason why this episode felt so rushed. You know what they say? Quality over quantity. Lapis vs. Juvia. I'm sorry, Anthony, but this episode has to go on the list. Now, don't get me wrong, Anthony did a great job with his part of the animation, but as for my part, well, not so much. You'll notice that there's a lot of clipping and glitching throughout the entire MMD fight scene. Most of it was unintentional, but some of it actually was. You see, Lapis and Juvia's bodies were passing through the floating blocks, but I did that on purpose because the blocks are supposed to be made of water, and I was trying to make it look like their bodies were passing through the water blocks. But sadly, that method failed. Now, aside from the animation, from my point of view, this episode has some of the most flawed research of my entire series. But considering that I've never watched Steven Universe, and I'm not exactly an expert on Fairy Tail either, I will admit I'm not exactly the most reliable source for information on these 2 specific characters. To be honest, I mainly just did this for my friend Anthony Stallings, since he's a big fan of Lapis and Steven Universe and all that. To be honest, there's not much else I could say about this episode, so let's move on. Natu vs. Spyro. Oh boy, where do I even begin? Well, for starters, the animation is terrible. Not only do the characters' models keep clipping through each other's bodies like glitchy ghosts, but another big problem with the animation was the stupid decision I made when using motions with the Spyro's model. You see, the specific MMD motions I was using were designed for humanoid models, and Spyro, being a dragon, has a quadrupedal structure, so his model just doesn't work well with motions that were designed for bipedal structured models. So trying to make Spyro do an automated punch or kick just doesn't work, which is why the animation looks really sloppy, especially on Spyro's part. Not to mention, the cringy Kamehameha scene at the end looks like two giant blue penises colliding into each other, and it just looks terrible. Okay, now that I'm done ranting about the awful animation, let's talk about the research. Now, I'll admit, the research was rather questionable. Some things were agreeable, and some were probably not. Now, it seems that this fight has gotten a lot more attention ever since Screw Attack released the death battle between Crash vs. Spyro, and people actually started using logic from that episode to back up their arguments. Now, I might sound a little bit of a hypocrite for saying that, because I'll admit that I have used some estimations from death battle before in the past, but only the scientific or mathematical calculations that originated from death battle episodes and nothing else. For instance, I have never once said that a certain character can beat another character just because they beat this character in a different Versus series. That kind of flawed logic should never be applied. Oh god, I'm getting off topic again. Anyway, rather if you agree with the result of Natu vs. Spyro or not, is up for you to decide. But the biggest claim that just about everyone has made as to why Spyro should have won was pointing out Spyro's planet level feat from the end of Dawn of the Dragon. I really didn't want to have to get into this argument, but now that I brought it up, I might as well put this to rest by explaining why I don't see Spyro's planet level feat the exact same way everyone else does. Oh boy, here we go. Now for starters, one thing that a lot of people seem to have overlooked is that when Spyro used his power to pull the Earth back together, he had to sacrifice himself in the process. Now, I have played Dawn of the Dragon, and Spyro has never displayed this level of power anywhere else other than the end of the game, or at least not that I remember. Not only was this move used to fix a planet and not exactly as an attack, but it's likely that this move was more of a last resort and Spyro wouldn't use it unless it's absolutely necessary or he has no choice because it knows it will kill him in the process. Now this is actually a very similar scenario to the Captain Falcon anime where Captain Falcon used his ultimate attack called the Desensu Falcon Punch, which was powerful enough to light up an entire galaxy. However, while this attack did destroy its intended target, it also destroyed Captain Falcon in the process. So this was basically a suicide move. This was obviously a last resort because Captain Falcon knew that his own ultimate attack would kill himself too. So the situation with Spyro's planet feat is actually not too different from this. When the entire world was being destroyed and Spyro knew he was gonna die either way, that's when it was necessary for Spyro to use this last resort and sacrifice himself to save the world. However, during a random fight against some guy Spyro has never met before, that being Natu, I highly doubt Spyro is just gonna jump to conclusion and immediately become destructively suicidal just like that. I think I've said enough. Now if you guys see this feat in a completely different way from how I see it, then that's fine. Nobody has to agree on everything. Oh, and not to mention, some people were probably thinking that I was a bit biased towards Natu in the episode, but that's not true. In fact, I actually like Spyro way more than Natu, so there was no personal bias towards Natu anywhere in this episode. You know what, I think I've rambled enough on this episode, so let's move on to number 2, shall we? Yang vs. Frino. Jeez, are all my Ruby fights on this list? Now, Yang vs. Frino is a good idea when you look at it on paper, but the way it was executed, not so great. For starters, if you look at the thumbnail, the title and characters' positions are swapped. That confusing sign alone tells you how much effort went into this. In fact, from how I feel, this has to be one of the laziest episodes I've ever done. The animation is lazy, the analysis was lazy, the entire episode pretty much has laziness written all over it. Now, the research was okay, but let's face it, if you know both these characters, the outcome was so obvious from the very beginning, and the reasoning for Yang winning was pretty obvious as well. So obvious that I barely put much effort into the research or explaining the results step by step. Now as for the animation, it's pretty much the same thing as Blake vs. Nightmare. Yang's model looks good, but the improvised model I used to represent Frino looks nothing like him and just looks atrocious. Combine the crappy improvised method from Blake vs. Nightmare with the poorly rendered animation from Spyro vs. Natu, and not to mention the old reused stock motions I've repeatedly used in older episodes, and you've got a recipe for a big old crap cake. Honestly, even Nini vs. Shante was more well put together than this, and that took less time to make. Not only was this episode really lazy, but it also just felt like a filler episode. In fact, that's exactly what it was, because at the end of the episode was a sneak peek of the next upcoming battle between Broly vs. Azura to get people hyped up for it. Other than that, the only thing about this episode that's worth watching is the part where I explain the controversy about me making too many Skylanders fights after the post-analysis is finished, and that's about it. There's really nothing else I could say about this episode. So how does the number 1 pick top this? Well, let's find out. MLG Jurg vs. Wanked Saitama. Oh boy, we reached the bottom of the barrel, people. Now for starters, this was the very first episode that features somebody's OC, and the last. And for good reasons too. Not only would tons of people be constantly harassing me to put their OCs in my series, and we can't have that, but perhaps it's best that OCs were just not meant to be in this series, judging by how this episode turned out. Now the only positive thing about this episode was the unique style of animation I chose, which was animating with clay. Claymation is actually a very unique and creative style of animation that you don't normally see in a Versus series. But other than that, there's pretty much nothing redeemable about this episode. The fight scene was absolute cringe, the research was even lazier than Yang vs. Phino, and this whole entire episode is nothing but a bad joke, and not to mention a dead meme. You see, I made this episode shortly after Animation Rewind released his big meme free-for-all, and everybody in the Cartoon Fight Club community was going crazy over the meme hype, creating their own fan-made meme OCs, and it was a big dank phenomenon. This was basically my ticket to board the meme hype train, using meme characters that were featured in the meme free-for-all, and one of them was an OC once again. But as soon as the train stopped, all the meme hype just faded away, and this episode got left in the dust, it lost all meaning, and is nothing more than just a worthless, dead meme. No offense to the person who created the OC, but this episode pretty much has no reason to exist anymore. In fact, when I upload this video, I'm gonna mark that episode as unlisted and make it the very first lost episode of Show-Off Showdown. If any of you want to find this now lost episode, rather if it's out of curiosity or just for laughs, then think of it as like a little scavenger hunt. In order to find the lost episode of Show-Off Showdown, you must go back to the very beginning. Now, what exactly do I mean by that, you may ask? Well, rather if it's the beginning of the Show-Off Showdown series, or the beginning of my whole channel, or something else, that's entirely up for you to decide. Good luck finding it. Don't know why you go looking for this piece of crap, but whatever. Now, while this series may have had some major stinkers throughout its existence, it's time to put all that behind us and look at the positive side of things. In other words, it is now time to list the top 10 best episodes of Show-Off Showdown. Now, once again, whichever ones you guys enjoy more or less is up to you, but this is just how I feel which episodes turned out the best. Now, let's get started, shall we? Mystique vs. Shang Tsung. Now, this is the true definition of a highly underrated episode. With the battle between two shapeshifters who could literally become almost anybody, the potential possibilities are endless. While the research was fine, where this episode really shines is the animation. In fact, this episode has some of the best animation of the entire series, and I have 3 amazing animators to thank for that. Rampage Animations, Smackaderp, and BLT Video Productions are all such incredibly talented animators, and it was such an honor to collaborate with them for this episode. While this episode isn't the most popular or attention-grabbing, I feel like it definitely deserves a lot more recognition and a spot as one of the greatest episodes on this list. Chaos vs. Frieza. Now, as most of you may know, Skylanders is a big part of this series, and while I was deciding which is the best of all my Skylanders fights, I was actually debating between this episode, Stealth Elf vs. Katana, and Knuckles vs. Terrafin. All 3 of them are great episodes, but considering that this episode is the most popular of all my Skylanders fights, and some people have been telling me it's one of their personal favorites, I eventually decided to put this one on the list. While it is true that the fight scene mostly lacked in actual animation, but it was still fun to watch, depending on how you look at it. Now, I will admit some of the research was rather questionable, but that's mainly because it's an older episode, and the circumstances that were applied in this episode are probably no longer relevant, especially considering how much Frieza has developed since then. But if you guys still enjoyed this episode, and would like to see a rematch with updated research and circumstances, then I just might be willing to do so. But if you like this episode the way it is, that's fine. It's entirely up to you. Lady Pirates Battle Royale. This was the very first 4-way Battle Royale of my series, and I think it turned out rather well. I mean, who wouldn't want to see a 4-way between 4 beautiful but deadly lady pirates duking it out in an epic swashbuckling showdown? With a complete full-on pre-analysis included in the video, which gives a brief but descriptive summary on all 4 fighters at once, this episode feels pretty much complete. While there may be a bit of a cringy scene or two, it's still an enjoyable episode nonetheless. It's definitely worth watching, and I think it fits quite well on this list. Hulk vs. Godzilla. I've been wanting to do this matchup for a long time, and that dream finally came true the day I brought this episode to life. Not only that, but it also just so happens to be the second most popular episode of Show-Off Showdown. In fact, while Animation Rewind sometimes spreads the word about some of my other popular episodes, this one managed to grow all on its own, which is quite impressive if you ask me. Now, while it is true that this episode didn't have the best animation, and while there were a lot, and I mean a lot of butthurt Godzilla fanboys in the comments, but aside from that, this is still an enjoyable episode, and I feel like this is definitely one of my best works of the series so far. Whether if you agree with the results or not is up for you to decide, but I still think it's a great episode nonetheless. Angry video game nerd versus Abobo. Out of all my episodes of Show-Off Showdown, this is one of those few that I'm the most proud of. Not only is this the very first episode that features a full-on pre-analysis included in the video, and I had a lot of fun making it, but this matchup is such an epic concept with a lot of potential, and definitely one of the most epic episodes I've done so far. While the animation isn't perfect, in fact it's actually the very first sprite animation I've ever made, but the pre-analysis definitely makes up for it. If you guys know the Angry Video Game Nerd, then he hardly needs an introduction. Though as for Abobo, not many people know him, but the ultimate tribute to the NES, called Abobo's Big Adventure, in my opinion is one of the greatest games of all time, and I highly recommend playing it, and I also highly recommend watching this episode. Oh, and by the way, would you believe me if I told you that I might have inspired the creator of Abobo's Big Adventure to make a possible sequel? No joke. Okay, moving on. Po vs. Shaq. Once again, another underrated episode with a lot of potential that not many people recognize. I'm sure most of you already know Po from Kung Fu Panda, but for those of you who don't know Shaq, then I highly recommend playing the game Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn. It's a very fun experience, and not to mention it feels kind of like one of those comedic parody movies like Spaceballs or Austin Powers. You know those kinds of movies, right? Anyway, this is also one of the most unique matchups I've ever done, as not many people have thought of this matchup. In fact, I don't think anyone has ever thought of it before. So this is definitely a fresh experience. While it is true that the fight scene doesn't last very long, especially when compared to the rest of the video, but it's still enjoyable nonetheless, especially for those of you who like to learn new things about unusual but interesting characters they've never heard of before. Anyway, this episode has a lot to offer, and it's definitely one of the most solid episodes of this series. Overall, it's an unusual but exciting experience that I think you'll really enjoy. Little word of advice, when you get to the video, make sure to skadoosh that like button. Yeah, I know, that was cringy, sorry. Moving on. Cuphead vs. Shovel Knight. Despite lacking a pre-analysis included in the video, this is still one of the most well-done episodes of the series. I remember how excited the MLG Avocado was to work on this, and we both had a lot of fun collaborating on it together. I mostly have him to thank for the awesome episode, considering that he wrote the script and did the amazing animation for this battle. Now on a side note, while Animation Rewind has also done a battle between Cuphead vs. Shovel Knight, and he used the exact same animation that the MLG Avocado made for this episode, the Show-Off Showdown version of Cuphead vs. Shovel Knight is arguably more well done than the CFC version. Now I'm not trying to sound egotistical or anything, I'm just saying that if you compare the two videos side by side, you'll likely notice a quality difference, and that the MLG Avocado put more effort into the script, explaining the outcome in more explicit detail. I'm not trying to trash talk Animation Rewind or anything like that. In fact, he will always be one of my favorite YouTubers. Anyway, the MLG Avocado was a big fan of both Cuphead and Shovel Knight, and if you're a big fan of both of them too, then this is definitely the right fight you've been looking for. TMNT versus Ruby. I'll admit, looking back at this episode, it's far from perfect, but I had to put this episode on the list, and it is the biggest episode of Show-Off Showdown I've ever worked on. It took many months, and an entire team of talented animators and researchers to bring this thing to life. Just the thumbnail alone tells you it's gonna be epic. I mean, it's a 4-on-4 team battle between the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles against Team Ruby. Just the idea of it is overall exciting and has a lot of potential. Now, does the episode live up to that potential? Well, there may be some flaws in the research, and most of the animation isn't exactly high quality. I still think it turned out rather well in the end. If you're a fan of either Ninja Turtles or Ruby, or both, then chances are you'll likely enjoy this episode. Not only is this the longest episode I've made so far, but it's also the most popular episode of Show-Off Showdown with over 17,000 views, and not to mention it's also the 7th most popular video on my entire channel. With such a big impact that it has left on both the series and channel's history, I believe it definitely deserves a spot as one of the greatest episodes of Show-Off Showdown. Inklings vs. Bendy Gang. Just like TMNT vs. RWBY, this is a huge episode that took a very long time to make. However, while TMNT vs. RWBY took an entire team to put together, this one, on the other hand, I have done 99% single-handedly. While the MLG Avocado did animate a short scene which looked really good, the rest of the episode I have done all independently. All the research, all the 3D animation, most of the 2D animation as well, and this entire thing was put together into one of the most solid episodes of this entire series. Having to work on something this big by yourself requires a lot more effort and dedication, especially if you don't have a huge team of people to have your back while working on it. Not to mention, I had to wait until all 5 chapters of Bendy and the Ink Machine to finally come out before I could finish this episode, and it took like 2 years for the whole game to be complete. That takes a lot of determination if you ask me. Now, even though this episode didn't have a whole team working on it, it's actually more of a solid episode than TMNT vs. RWBY, and the overall execution and presentation of it makes it one of the most well-done episodes of this series so far. It has one of the longest and most in-depth pre-analysis with very thorough detailed research on 8 different characters, and the fighting sequence is just as entertaining to watch. Not to mention, it's definitely a lot more well done than the first battle between Inkling vs. Bendy, that's for sure. If you're a hardcore fan of either Splatoon or Bendy and the Ink Machine, then chances are this is the perfect episode for you. Even if you're not a big fan of either of these two, it's still one of the greatest episodes of Show-Off Showdown and definitely worth your view. Shante vs. Crash Bandicoot. Out of all my episodes of Show-Off Showdown, this episode is potentially the crown jewel to the series' crown. Hopefully that didn't sound too cliche. Not only is this one of the matchups I feel the most proud of, but it is quite possibly the most complete and solid episode of this entire series. Just about everything about it screams yes from start to finish. Just the idea of these two characters fighting alone is just plain epic. The research and the pre-analysis was very thorough and top-notch, and the animation was phenomenal. Now, I'm not trying to give myself a pat on the back or anything. In fact, this episode was actually yet another collaboration or team effort. Not only did Leopold the Brave help me with most of the research on Crash Bandicoot, but the animators who worked on the fight sequence are just incredible. Definitely some of the best animation of this entire series. Maybe even on par with the animators from Mystique vs. Shang Tsung, but that's debatable. Anyway, this episode has just about everything it takes to form a perfectly solid versus episode, and it is definitely one of the most epic matchups that this series has to offer. If you have not seen this episode yet, then I highly recommend checking it out, as it has earned the honor of being one of the greatest, if not the greatest episode of Show-Off Showdown. So there you have it. These are my picks for the top 10 worst and best episodes of Show-Off Showdown. Now, if there are any episodes that you guys liked more or less than others, then that's fine. Which ones were your most favorite or least favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Now, we are currently 43 episodes into the series so far, not including the lost episode, and this series is still continuing. Chances are the results on this list will likely change sooner or later, eventually, but for now, these are the top highlights of the first 2 years of Show-Off Showdown. Will there be greater or worse episodes in the future? Well, who knows? For now, I'll say this much. I've got something big planned for the Season 1 finale of Show-Off Showdown, which will occur once episode 50 hits. Though it's probably not going to happen for quite a while, so don't get your hopes up just yet. But I promise you, it will be worth the wait. Until then...
Got any ideas for Show-Off Showdown? Then let me know in the comments below. And hopefully, I just might do them. Now stay tuned for the next episode of Show-Off Showdown!